Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Unit Masters. This is the second week of our 6 weeks journey. We are in batch 5 of the Unit Masters. So welcome everyone who's here. We have today as our speaker Dr. Joshua Ellul, and he's based in Malta. And Joshua is the director of the Center for Distributed Ledger Technologies and chairman of Malta Digital Innovation Authority. And as such, he's actively shaping the strategy for one nation, apart from building a lot of relevant content and education tools and inform decision makers and regulatory bodies about how to bring the system or the ecosystem into a shape where it can gain mainstream adoption. So in this week of Unit Masters, we focus on the ecosystem, the new economy ecosystem, and the different players. And we invited Dr. Ellul or Joshua to share his perspective on, what are the key relevant players, ecosystem actors, and what is the trend? How can we actually look at the ecosystem in a bird's perspective? Thank you very much, Joshua, for joining us. And I hand over the stage to you. And please introduce yourself and also where are you coming from? Because for us here in this community, it's super important to understand the speaker's background, because that informs how they are actually, or from which perspective are they looking at the ecosystem. Thank you.
Thanks, Dib. Okay, so given the poll, I think it might make sense that before we get into some deeper discussion on the ecosystem, that maybe I give an introduction to what blockchain is. And I'm coming from the perspective of a computer science academic and a programmer. And I got interested in the space really because I wanted to make money from all this hype that was going on. But I ended up getting more busy with helping out the government and regulation and also creating an education program at the university. So I think we'll start with what blockchain is. What does it mean to us, the layman? Let's not talk about how it works internally, because no one really cares about that except for us geeks. And then we'll see some different aspects to blockchain. Now, I invite you, as I'm going on, feel free to interrupt and ask questions. I'd rather be interrupted and help sort out any misconceptions whilst I'm going on, rather than have anyone get lost. Okay, so I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Yes. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to start off with blockchain and the need for multidisciplinarity. And let's just talk about services in general. So if we think about how we use services, really from the beginning of time till the mid-90s, really, it involved a physical interaction at a particular location. So if we were going to undertake a bank transfer, you would have to go to a bank or go to a postal service office to undertake any interaction. So it was really focused around a physical location. And then we also had some teleservices, but they never really picked up. And in the mid-90s, along came the internet revolution. We could use these very same services from our homes, from our offices, just by logging onto a computer at our disposal. And we had access to information retrieval, buying books online, or even undertaking our own transactions from the comfort of our homes or offices. And then the mobile revolution. So we could use these very same services from the mid-2000s just by reaching into our pocket. So we're no longer restricted to a location to use these services, but we're now mobile, able to use whatever services we want to. And the thing is, if we think about the internet revolution and what mobile brought to us, it was very easy for the end users to understand, what does it mean to us? How do we interact with these services? And now that blockchain is upon us, and many people are saying that this is a revolution, there's one problem, is that it's very hard to understand what is changing in regards to the services for us, the end users. What is actually changing in the way that we will interact with these services? And the thing is, nothing is going to change in regard to how we interact with these services. So everything's remained the same. Ignore some complexities of how the actual technology is a bit clunky at the moment, but really and truly we'll be interacting with a web-based interface, with a website, and yet we'll be using blockchain under the hood. And if the way we're interacting with these services isn't changing, then what is changing? And it's all a question of trust. So Let's again consider how we buy books and how we sell books, let's say using Amazon. So Amazon here is this essential service provider. We trust Amazon to host our books when we're selling books through Amazon. And when I want to buy books, I pay Amazon and I trust that they will undertake that service for me. They are the central service provider. We have to trust them, right? And similarly with banks. When I, let's say, want to pay YIP some funds, I ask my bank if transfer funds for me. And the bank here has my funds. I trust those funds at the bank. And when I tell them, please send my funds, we hope that the bank will undertake that transaction for us. So they're this central service provider that we are trusting to undertake some service on our behalf. And if you think about how payments are made, so this is really where the whole space came from. We have Bob, and Bob wants to send 10,000 euros to Alice. Maybe he's buying some childish hobbies from Alice. And he might live in a small place like Malta, where he goes to a bank and he says, can you please send my 10,000 euros to Alice? Or he might even do this using his mobile app. Yeah, Bob is a bit weary of disclosing why he's sending this money to Alice. But the bank asks, what is it for? And Bob doesn't want to disclose this because he lives in a small place and the person behind the desk or even the person processing the transaction might know Bob. And Bob says, I would rather not say it's private. Now, the bank, rightly so, says they cannot perform this transaction for Bob because that's a large amount of money. And banks have to abide by rules of anti-money laundering and funding of terrorism. So they say, I'm sorry, that transaction can't happen. But Bob here is frustrated. And Bob said, this is my money. Why can't I send my money to Alice? And this is where the idea of Bitcoin really came from. The ability to have person-to-person transactions, much like cash transactions, yet they're digital. And we might think that we already have this sort of mechanism in place if we use internet banking, that I log on to my app, I send funds to YIP, and YIP automatically gets those funds. But really and truly what's happening under the hood is there's a bank processing that transaction who is accepting or even chooses to reject that transaction. So the idea of Bitcoin was the ability for Bob to issue that transaction, and there's no intermediary, there's no bank, there's no authority in between who can approve or has the right to stop that transaction. So this is really where the ethos behind Bitcoin came, the ability to create a system that has peer-to-peer, person-to-person transactions without anyone in between. And there's no middleman, there's no intermediary in the system. So if you have any questions, do ask immediately or type in the chat. If we look at how we can create a banking system, really it's quite simple. Now, when I say simple, I mean in terms of complexity. You have a database system storing all the accounts, all the transactions. It gets a bit more complicated when you have different banks communicating with each other, but it's still very simple to do. Now, what this system needs to do is make sure that you can't spend more money than you have. And you also can't spend other people's funds. So we have some rules governing how we can spend our funds. But the very important thing is that there's only one system. There's only one database of how much funds you have in your account. Because if there are two different systems, you could overspend. So there needs to be one version of truth. How much money do you have in your account? And what we needed to achieve in order to remove the middleman is to create a system where there's no single central system, where anyone can execute any transaction with anyone else without having to rely on a single database, without having to rely on a single bank. So the idea behind decentralization and blockchain and Bitcoin was to have every single node or computer in the network having a list of all transactions and all accounts. So all the data associated with all accounts and transactions is replicated everywhere. If you were to start up a Bitcoin node, you would download a copy of all transactions, all accounts that ever took place. So this is how it achieves this decentralization, by copying, by replicating all the data at every single point in the network. And this was actually quite a problematic type of system to achieve in the past. We had no way of achieving this to assure that these rules are upheld. to make sure that you cannot double spend, which means you cannot spend your last Bitcoin for a burger at one side of the network and at another side of the network spend your last Bitcoin for a book. So we had no way of achieving this up until 2010, when the Bitcoin paper was proposed by Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever it or they may be. And the solution that Satoshi Nakamoto provided in this Bitcoin paper was the solution to this problem, the ability to create a network where all the data is replicated throughout the system, yet at the very same time, we can assure that certain properties are upheld, that you cannot overspend, you cannot double spend, and also that you are the only controller of your resources. Now, this is what the blockchain is. When you think about what is blockchain, blockchain is the mechanism that allows for us to create this type of system where there's no single point of trust, where there's no single server, single authority who has control, as opposed to systems of the past where there was reliance on single central server providers. And this type of system in the past, we could also have many different computers working together redundantly, but they were always under the hood of a single owner. Now we have the ability to create these decentralized systems where there is no single owner, and that is what the blockchain is. And I recommend reading, if you have time, if you want to learn more about blockchain, because we don't have enough time to go into everything. The End of Money by New Scientist. It's a really excellent first read for blockchain. Now, if we think about how the actual end users are going to be using the system, if I'm sending Yip some money, from my perspective over here, I'm just going to be using a website. I'm just going to be using an app. So really, what's going on in the inside, I have no idea as a user perspective. So the usability of the system is indistinguishable from the old types of systems. So users do not see what's going on, but users who know that they're using a blockchain have certain guarantees that they rely on. They now know that there is, if they're using a blockchain, there is no single owner of the system. No one can interfere in the system. The rules that are implemented in the system are guaranteed. No one can cheat in the system. Now, if we actually think about what then Bitcoin is, ignoring all this blockchain stuff, Bitcoin is just a ledger. It's a ledger where we have different accounts, like in our banks. I own 10 Bitcoin, Gordon owns 3, Alice owns 6. And if I want to send my 3 Bitcoin to Gordon, I just add a transaction into the network. I sign it off using, let's say, my username and my password, but really it's using a cryptographic key, but let's ignore that. It's like using your user credentials. And I will just insert into the system that I'm sending Gordon 3 Bitcoin. A transaction is added into the ledger. In every single node in the network, this transaction is going to be added. And we update the balances. And that's it. Now Gordon has these 3 Bitcoin. And it's very important that this ledger, that when this transaction is added, it can never be removed. And this, if you may have heard the term immutability flying around, the blockchain is immutable. Really and truly, the blockchain is not immutable. The blockchain is append only. We can add transactions to it. However, the transaction is immutable. Once added, the transaction can't be changed and neither removed. So that is what Bitcoin is. It's nothing more than a ledger that allows for the owner of their particular Bitcoin to transfer their Bitcoin. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, so just to disambiguate a bit, Bitcoin is the very first instance, the very first cryptocurrency that was proposed. There are other types of cryptocurrencies like Ethereum, Cardano, there's loads of other types. Bitcoin is just one, like US dollar is one denomination, euro is another. Cryptocurrency is just one thing we can achieve using blockchain. We can create other types of applications, not just about tracking money, and we'll look at that very soon. And blockchain is just one type of distributed ledger. There are many other types of implementing these distributed ledgers, such as DAG, hash graphs. For now, just assume that when you hear blockchain, it's talking about a distributed ledger, and assume that they're one and the same, even though they're not. There's different ways of achieving a distributed ledger. And each distributed ledger, whether it's blockchain or whatever else, can be public, which means anyone can get access to it. So Bitcoin, we can just download software and start using the Bitcoin network. We can start using Bitcoin. I can start transferring Bitcoin to you. I can also start looking at all transactions that ever took place. I can actually look at an exchange in Malta and see all transactions where people are buying Bitcoin from it and selling Bitcoin, because all this information is public in a public blockchain, and Bitcoin is public. Now, this might raise the question, okay, so who really wants to use a system where all that information is public? And a lot of people say that Bitcoin is anonymous, but it's not really anonymous, it's pseudo-anonymous. And the thing is, it's associated with Bitcoin, you have your account number and any transactions associated with that account. So your personal details aren't associated with it. However, this puts a lot of people into a false sense of security that it is anonymous when the first time I send you funds, you now know my account number and you can see all of my transaction history. So if you want to remain anonymous, you need to make sure that you're never revealing who you are in association with that particular account. But then there's also a question of, what do we do if we want this type of solution where there's no single controller of a system, and yet we don't want all that information to be public? We have confidential information. Well, that's where private or permission blockchains come in. The very same principle that we're doing to allow for anyone to use the system in a public manner, we can restrict that to the parties that we want. We can say, let's create a blockchain inside of this class where we are the only ones who have access to it. And we can transfer funds between ourselves associated with potentially paying for the next class. And you can get stars in a class, but it's restricted to this class. So we have this mechanism, and it can either be completely open or we can restrict who gets access to it. Now, just a summary of what blockchain guarantees. It guarantees that there's single ownership, although there are ways, if you want to achieve it, we can even implement fractional ownership. And this is something that a lot of people now are investigating, because we could never own a Mona Lisa in the past. But now various art collectors are looking into fractional ownership of art, let's say a Mona Lisa, where we all would have a fraction of it. But let's assume for now that there's single ownership, no overspending, you can't spend more funds than you have, and you can't double spend. And double spend and overspend are really similar, but it's more talking about how it's implemented in the system. You can't spend your last euro at two different parts in the network at the same time. And the ledger guarantees that all data, all transactions can never be deleted or modified. Okay. And most importantly, there's no central authority. So we could achieve this in the past, but there was always a central authority. There was a bank checking each transaction, saying, yes, yes, you have these funds, and yes, we allow you to spend these funds. Whereas now, there's no one making these checks. It is the software that is undertaking these checks. Okay, and it's not just about money. I've been talking about Bitcoin, but what is stopping us from tracking property ownership? I might own a place in Floriana, which is a town in Malta, and I bought it from Paul, and nothing happens except for adding a transaction to the ledger. And then I might decide to sell this property to Gordon. What happens? Again, we add a transaction to the ledger. So we can keep track of more than just Bitcoin, more than just money. We can keep track of digital assets that are associated with real world assets. And this is where some interesting problems come to light. So I've been talking about implementing a system, software, keeping track of ownership. But now that we're talking about ownership, who cares if this digital asset, this digital ledger that we're keeping track of property, does our land really honor the fact that it says that I own this place in Floriana? Or is it the key in my hand? Or is it that piece of paper in the land registry? And this is where there's interesting questions of multidisciplinarity, talking about how we can implement such systems and whether the digital ownership of this asset, which is nothing more than a record in the database, how does that translate into real ownership inside of the legal world? And this is where we're starting to question the legal world. Can we have digital ownership represented in this system when it's not actually represented inside of some land registry? Do we need to change the land registries? So we're starting to see this overlap between tech and law and how the two meet. And it's not just about property. Let's take this example. So let's say we have these parking passes where we want to reduce cars on the road and we want to incentivize people to be more eco-friendly by using public transportation, by walking more. And the more you use public transportation, you're rewarded with these special tokens. The more that you do not use your card, the more tokens you're given. However, if you want to park in these special bays, which might be really close to your office or might have some special, perhaps limited parking for special people who have these passes, you have to pay to use these. So you have this mechanism of receiving and also paying. But there's these rules in place that every time you use a bus, you get paid one pass. Now, we have a ledger just like before, and we can update this ledger when I pay. But these rules here, how am I guaranteed that I will actually be given a token when I get a bus? How can I be guaranteed? Because these are the rules that, let's say there's an authority who's promising that I will get a pass. How can I trust this authority? Well, you might say, well, you have to trust the authority. Well, yes, that's what we used to do in the past. But is there any way to remove this authority, this parking pass authority, or whatever authority it is? Is there a way to instill these rules into the system where no one can cheat, where I am guaranteed that if I get on a bus and I sit on that bus for a journey, that I'm guaranteed that I will be given this token? So this is where you may have heard about smart contracts. Smart contracts come in. And smart contracts is this idea that there are rules encoded in code executing on a blockchain that if you follow the rules, you are guaranteed no one can stop that code from executing. Now, smart contracts are a bit illy termed because when we say smart in computer science, it typically means artificial intelligence, and contracts in the legal world typically defines rules that you need to follow and consequences if you don't, and obligations. Smart contracts have nothing to do with that. Smart contracts are code applications that execute on a blockchain. What they are rules that automatically follow and execute something based on the rules. There are no consequences because you cannot break the contract. So if we wanted to implement, let's say, this example where we're buying property and this company, Greater Charleston Property, says, when you buy property from them, they guarantee that they will give 10% of the property cost to a charity of your choice. So they're incentivizing you to buy property from them. And how would we go about achieving this? Well, traditionally, we could sign a contract with this company, but how can we be sure that they will actually follow through on this donation? We have to trust them. We could take them to court, but it would be very hard to find out whether they've undertaken that donation or not, because they're probably not just dealing with you, they're dealing with hundreds of other people. And where does your donation fit inside of this? All the funds they're sending out, they might keep back a bit of those funds. So that solution's okay if you're fine with it. Then there's another solution that we typically use, that of notaries, trusted parties. So I might pay my full amount to a notary, just like we do right now. And the notary might pay 90% to this company and 10% to the charity. And that's great. But what happens if we don't trust the notary and the notary somehow pockets some of this fund? Well, I hope there are no notaries in here. We should trust our notaries. But there's an alternative to this now. We can use smart contracts. And the idea of a smart contract is this piece of code that can hold funds, it can hold Bitcoin, it holds digital assets, but it also can send those funds and use those funds in a particular manner. Now, if I wanted to implement a smart contract for this application, the code would look something like this. Now, this is English over here, but there's nothing stopping us from writing English-like code like this that gets translated down into computer code. So we do have these tools available. And what is happening over here is we have this contract, 10%, it can be called whatever we want to. And all it's doing is keeping track of the funds inside the smart contract. How much? So if I'm buying a property from it, it will keep track of that funds in here. Now, we have two different, as such, buttons, functionality that we can use on the smart contract. The first is, if I'm going to buy a property from this company, Greater Charleston, I will pass in my funds to it, much like a bank transfer. I will send in 100K for a piece of, for some land, and the contract will automatically send 10% to the charity of my choice, and the remaining 90% will be kept inside the smart contract. Now, because this is happening on a blockchain, this 10%, I can verify, I can look in the blockchain and see that this transaction actually took place, this 10%. It's publicly available information. No one can cheat, even though this company created the smart contract. Even if they wanted to stop it or to change this code over here, they could not. These rules are in the smart contract forever. And the other functionality is that this company wants the ability to withdraw its funds. So only the company can withdraw the funds inside of this account, inside of the smart contract. Are there any questions at this point? You can think about this much like a vending machine. This analogy is often used. It might help for some people that each action on a smart contract is like a button. You're interacting with a machine. And in this first button, you might be passing money in to buy your smart contract. And anyone, sorry, to buy your property, and anyone can buy a property. But if you were to try to withdraw funds from the smart contract, inside of this code, it's saying only the company, Greater Charleston Properties, can withdraw money. So it does exactly what it's written to do. Now, all of this is talking about decentralization. If we want to make sure that we have the ability for different parties, us in this classroom, to work together where no one can cheat, where we put into place certain rules, and these rules have to be upheld. Now, let's say that I were to create a web-based system that you would log on to and we would interact with each other. Perhaps we're creating a voting system on whether to move on to the next topic or not. And I create a web-based interface and you all put in your preference, much like the Zoom polls that are used. Really and truly, the individual who maintains that system, in this particular case, is Zoom, or in my case, if I created a web-based system that you put in your preferences to, I could manipulate that. So where there are questions of who can manipulate this data, who can manipulate these processes or rules, if we want to remove that ability, then smart contracts and blockchain is a good use for that. Ultimately, if you decide that you might need a solution like this, where you want to make sure no one can cheat, where you need this ability of decentralization, I recommend, because a lot of people in this space were saying use blockchain for everything, and that was a terrible idea. We should only use blockchain where required. If you ultimately come to the solution that blockchain is useful for you, always ask the question, would a central server somewhere, if I pay Amazon, if I pay Google to host a server and a company to create the system for me, is that acceptable for what we want? If it is, then use that. Don't use blockchain, because that means you're happy with trusting the maintainer of that system, and you're happy with trusting the host and the software developers associated with that system. So are there any questions at this point?
We have a few questions already, Joshua. I was wondering, do you want to just finish your presentation and then we start to ask all the questions?
I would say let's go on with the questions because I have loads of material.
So there's a question from Jeffrey who asked, can you update, change a smart contract?
Very good question. So the short answer is no, you cannot update a smart contract. And that's a problem because if you have a smart contract out there, which is managing millions of euros or dollars of funds, which we do, and you have a bug, you can potentially lose all those funds. And this has happened. You will find loads of news articles where millions of euros of funds have been locked away or lost or stolen. And that's the no part to the question. You cannot update a smart contract, but you can update the rules in the overall system that you've been thinking about. So a system can be comprised of many smart contracts. And if you thought at the very beginning that you might want the ability to change some rules, and you've put in the thought into this first smart contract that you uploaded, that you might want to update a bit of it, there are ways where you upload a new smart contract and you point to the new smart contract from the old smart contract. So if you've thought about it very carefully, you can update rules, but you cannot update an existing smart contract. So only if you thought about it before. However, the question then is, if we can update the rules in our system, should your users trust you? So if we create a smart contract between all of us, and I say I can update certain rules in the system, well, maybe we shouldn't be using that smart contract because I am still a central authority who can control the system. So there's this fine balance between updatability of the rules and the logic versus guarantees that are provided in not enabling for updatability.
Yes, thanks very much for explanation. Also, in next week's workshops, we will speak about the do your own research basics, basically where topics such as this, like red flags of when you look at a contract and see what are actually things where you should be very suspicious if the contract team, like the contract writer, puts certain rules in it. There's a follow-up question from Jeffrey. Can you do as many inceptions in the smart contract as you want?
Inceptions?
Jeffrey, do you mean like changes or like these kinds of rules where you allow for space to update the contract later? Yeah. I guess the question would be, you know, how free are you in creating a smart contract? How many options can you include?
So it depends really on the platform, but the most popular platform, which is Ethereum, is quite restricted in regards to the flexibility of a smart contract, in regards to how long the contract can be, and in regards to the complexity, so how many operations can be undertaken. And the reason behind this is that if you think about what this smart contract is, it's a program executing on a blockchain. Now that means it is a program executing on a single computer. Really what we're achieving with a blockchain is one single shared computer across the world. All of these computers together, and that's what we're achieving, this shared computer. And in a shared computer that we're using one at a time, you don't want to be able to run a very long program, because if I run a program for 30 minutes, no one else can use it. So this is why Ethereum limits you to only execute very short pieces of code at a time. Now, there are different types of platforms. There are private blockchains that allow for, let's say, us to create a system between us. And in that type of system, you end to have more flexibility. So it really depends. But what I would say is for most types of applications that you want to achieve, you can come up with a solution for it based upon the technology.
Thanks a lot for clarification. I guess we have here now more of an ecosystem question from Anchor. It says, can a blockchain be on a decentralized ledger, which is public, but at the same time, the mining or consensus of this blockchain be private? What would that mean?
Okay, yeah, so when we have a blockchain system, we have what we call miners, and the miners are the computers that are making sure the system remains secure. And they do this by spending a lot of money, a lot of electricity. Let's not go into the details how it does it, but this is what miners are doing. They're securing the network by spending money and undertaking some computation. Now, currently, something like Bitcoin, something like Ethereum, anyone can set up a miner. Anyone can help secure the network. And why would you do this? People don't do this because they just want to create a secure network for the benefit of the world, even though we should maybe. But they're given rewards. When they help to secure the network and they're adding on some information, they're given a reward. They're given Bitcoin. Now, if we wanted to create a system where, let's say, only us in this room are going to be the miners, we want to create a secure network because it's more efficient for us to work together in the beginning, perhaps, because we don't want external people in our system, but yet everyone else can use it in the world. Yes, we can. We can create a system where we are only the miners and anyone in the world can use it. And in fact, there are blockchain platforms that started out like this. And they started out like this because there's this issue of what they call the 51% attack, where if there are many people who are trying to attack a network, 51% more are trying to attack it than you have individuals trying to maintain, keep the network secure. It is possible to undertake an attack on the network. Now, this type of attack, it doesn't mean the network will stop. What it means is that for a short period of time, you will end up having two versions of truth, the 51% truth and the real truth. And this is where someone can say, I'll spend a bit of my Bitcoin on the fake truth and the real truth. And this is where we need to be careful. But really and truly, people do not undertake this on the Bitcoin network. Why? Because it will cost them so much money to undertake this attack that they will not possibly get enough money in return to make up for that attack that they've undertaken. So the short answer is yes, we can create this private network with a public access. You can create any hybrid of a system that you want. Even if you wanted to create, like say for a government, a system where only the government and different entities in the government can submit transactions to assure that the public out there can look into the data and say, you really followed the rules of public procurement. You didn't cheat. You didn't let your friend's tender bid beat all the others. It's publicly verifiable. Yet, the government probably doesn't want everyone to be able to make changes to this data. So they would make it read-only to the public. So we can come up with all types of hybrids for these types of solutions.
Yes. So maybe let's speak about the application for the banking. Isabel had a question. She says, like, one of the features is that it's immutable. That's what you mentioned earlier. She asked, are there instances of traditional banks changing the record? Or is this just a characteristic or an assurance from Satoshi's paper that this network contains immutability?
So because all the nodes in the network are keeping a history of all transactions, and because the ledger, one rule that all these nodes are abiding by to say that this is the canonical truth, this is the truth, is that the longer the ledger, the more transactions, or really the more blocks, but let's say it's the more transactions you have, that is the real ledger. If there's another ledger somewhere else that has more transactions, you suddenly change over to it. Now, because of this mechanism, which we call proof of work, it's impossible to remove any data because it's always going to be the longer ledger. The only way you can remove data is that everyone in the network agrees, let's remove some data. Now, even if you're one or two people in the network and you have this long list of data, this long list of transactions, that is the actual truth according to the protocol, according to what the Bitcoin network is. And if anyone wants to change this, if they say, you know what, let's remove this, it's not advantageous for us, they can, but they will no longer be working on what is called Bitcoin. And you'll just have two people in the world working on real Bitcoin. So in the real Bitcoin, you can never remove data from it. You can convince everyone else in the world to, and if you do, that's great. But if there's one person with all that data, it's still the real Bitcoin, according to the protocol. So really, this brings to light a lot of social aspects, that it's not just about technology, it's about democratic values between the different operators working together to secure this network. And now when it comes to banks, without pointing fingers to any particular banks or countries, yes, this has taken place. Yes, we've even heard of banks who have their live system and they have what they call, I think they're calling it the shadow system or something like that. It's where they do their dodgy stuff and they don't put that into the live system. In a blockchain, it's there for good.
Yes, shadow system. Sometimes it's just done for operational efficiencies, though, because they don't have the databases that mirror one customer view point. So it's not necessarily on bad intentions. We have a very strategic question, and just 1 second, I need to find it. Ainoa, she asked, what are the highest risks the blockchain would have to deal with in the near future? What would actually happen if there were an electricity blackout, for example, intended or because of natural causes, or something like a cyber pandemic type of
That's right.
event?
Yep. So, and even perhaps, let's say we break encryption or something like that. So the thing is, if all systems, if all our computing systems cannot operate, if we lose electricity across the world for whatever reason, the blockchain will cease to operate, just like all our other banking systems and all our other computing systems. The thing is then, when we next start up our computers, will that data still be there? If yes, then the blockchain will continue to operate as normal. And so will our banking systems. If we lose all data, but this is a problem across the board, both our blockchain-based systems and our traditional banking systems would have lost their data. The same goes for if we manage to break encryption. So a lot of people talk about, will quantum computing break the blockchain? So if quantum computing breaks our existing cryptography, it will not just break blockchain, it will break the internet as we know it, and we can suddenly log into our banks and increase our euro balances, which would be great, right? But the good side is that quantum computing really and truly is just a much faster computer. And how do we secure our existing computers, our existing networks, using the same level of computing power that people are trying to attack with? So once quantum computers become available, or even whatever type of computing power that's fast, we will just upgrade our existing systems with those fast computers as well. Not only that, to get around such problems, what we do is the level of encryption, the strength of the encryption, how hard it is to crack. Typically, we have a key, and let's say our key used to be so many bytes, 128-bit length. What we do is we just create a larger key size. And to become quantum resistant, we just create a much larger key as well. So I would say the problems associated with these types of risks are problems across the board. Now, the one problem that blockchain has that other types of systems do not have where they're centralized is that, let's say that we come up with a rift in our network where we say the left side of the world is not going to speak to the right side of the world. They're on completely different intranets and they're not going to communicate with each other. If that lasts for a while, you're going to end up with two different ledgers, two completely different ledgers, which started off the same, but then diverged. As soon as that network connection is rejoined, according to what Bitcoin says, it says always adopt the longer network. So these two networks would join and suddenly we would lose all that half of the history that took place in. So that is one problem that we have in blockchain-based systems. And providing that we don't see such an end of the world day scenario, we're fine. But perhaps we should start thinking about how to get around such situations.
Yes. How about a question again from Anchor? Is it true for Bitcoin that even if there is one single node keeper who has the ledger intact, the entire network could be restored?
Yes, definitely. Now, the big question is, when the other computers start up, are they going to keep using the same rules that define what Bitcoin is? Or, because it's all about the people in the network. It's all about, as miners, as operators, what rules do we abide by? If we all decide to change those rules, then that one person will work on his own and perhaps be the real Bitcoin. But if the rest of the world is working on something else, then what is Bitcoin? So it's hard to say. No, it's hard to say because it's governed by people. And I think people are very unpredictable. However, people are incentivized and people like to maintain their funds. As long as everyone wants to maintain the amount of what Bitcoin they own and that it has some value to the real world, they will not try to attack the Bitcoin network, because what they will achieve is they will manage to devalue Bitcoin and devalue their own funds. So this is one mechanism that is keeping Bitcoin in place, unless everyone in the world decides, you know what, let's lose all our value.
Great, thank you very much for clarification. Let's fast forward a few years. It's 2030, Joshua. And now, all your bold dreams about, I don't know what they are, you can share in a second. All your bold dreams about blockchain adoption, mainstream adoption have come true. How does the world look like by that time? How does every person's daily lives look like in your view?
Yeah. Okay, so let's not go to 230 yet, because this is only around the corner. So there are central bank digital currencies being proposed. So much like China has the digital yuan, this European Central Bank is looking into the digital euro. These are systems that are very much like blockchain, except for they're governed by national entities. And they aim to give us a lot of the benefits of blockchain, but governed by them. Now, suddenly what we'll have is the opportunity to create cool new types of companies that are automated, like that rental property contract I showed you, using our central bank. Now, that's probably not too revolutionary. It's providing a lot of efficiency for us, but it's not questioning the powers that be. Now, if we move towards a system where everyone's using Bitcoin and decentralized networks where there is no power behind it, then I think we start questioning society, so, our existing notion of the democratic vote winning. Now, where would we be? I think we would start to question the central powers. which central powers are we happy with? Which central powers are we not happy with? I think that is the question we should be asking today. However, a lot of people in this space, at least in the beginning, were saying down with all central powers. We don't need any central powers. Let's automate everything through decentralization. I don't think that's a solution. I think what we need to do is identify what works for us and what doesn't work. Now, if we start to think that these decentralized systems will be so pervasive, we can think about getting rid of certain laws, not all laws, the types of laws that can be automated through code, the types of laws that can check whether you filed your tax returns automatically and give you some sort of rebate based upon filing on time or penalties. So we can think about more automation, but I think the revolutionary aspect is whether we want to decentralize powers. And there's a book called The Sovereign Individual, which was written in the 2000s. And it's about questioning whether we're moving towards a world where there are less sovereign powers over us and the individuals together become sovereign powers individually. This technology can bring such a revolution. Now, I'm not sure whether we'll get there. And the reason is because I'm not sure of people. Because I think as a people, we are quite happy with our central powers. I mean, not completely, but I am not sure whether we would actively go against those powers. In times like these, in times of COVID, in times of technological change, in times of microbes, we've typically in history seen revolutionary change. It could come around. It depends on people. So unfortunately, I'm not a social scientist. I wish I was, because this is really where the interesting change will come. The technology is just the enabler in this aspect. I know I've rambled on. I hope I've somehow talked about the question.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. Looking back on your career or even your journey in the crypto space, what was the happiest moment or one of the happy moments that you've experienced?
Yeah, so when I started out, Malta soon after announced it would become the blockchain island. And the first thing that came to my mind is governments, these guys are going to ruin everything I've been working on. So I reached out to them, and I found that their plan was actually more of a business drive. Let's bring business to Malta in this space. And we started to help the government with regulation. And that was actually a point in my career where I was quite happy. I started to get in another sector that I'm not versed in. So I'm a computer scientist, and yet we're talking about the regulation of a country potentially based upon technology. And that was an eye-opener for me, that we are now working in a time of potential change where technology is going to change the way that society works. And this is whether or not we implement regulation, whether or not the world moves in this direction, technology does change society. And we've seen this with Facebook using AI algorithms, making us more addictive to platforms. It changes our opinion. And I would say that was one of the most eye-opening moments of my life, where I started to realize that technology is just not just about the developers creating this tech. This technology and what we're creating has potential to change society and is changing society. And we need to be careful that we're creating a society that is a society that we actually want in the future. So I've gotten involved in regulation now, the regulation of blockchain, regulation of artificial intelligence. And this is an area that I've become quite keen on not only following, but giving my 2 cents worth, because there are different opinions around the world. The States has really gone for let's regulate the sector, let's use the technology where it needs to be used and regulate the technology when it needs to be regulated in a particular sector or in a particular use. Whereas the EU is going for an approach of let's regulate the technology across the board. And I'm not really keen on that, because I think we'll be stifling the use of AI in Europe. Especially when all the meetings I go to, everyone's saying Europe is lagging behind the States and China in AI, and yet we're coming up with this type of stifling regulation. So I would say the involvement in different disciplines, bringing together different disciplines, law, business, finance, technology, under one hood, that has been one of the most exciting experiences for me, to work with lawyers, to work with economists and tokenomics, and not just work in my own bubble. And I highly recommend that to other individuals, because suddenly your world becomes much larger, and the challenges you're working on become much larger.
Thanks very much for that piece of advice. Maybe before we close and go into 7 minutes of breakout rooms just for networking, share one piece of advice you would give to non-techies, like people outside of computer science, how to get involved into shaping this new ecosystem, this new economy.
Yeah, so I would recommend first reading some books that provide a general introduction to what the technology means, not how it works. I mean, if we look at email, who knows that there's SMTP, which operates at TCP/IP underneath it? No one cares. People care, what does email mean to us? Same thing with blockchain and decentralization. Proof of work, which makes blockchain work, is really cool. It's a really cool invention. But no one needs to know about it except for us techies or someone who's interested. So it's the concept of decentralization that is quite interesting, the concept of potential societal decentralization. Now, if we think back to the times of Greece, where democracy really emerged from, right? And individuals used to go to different forums and vote for what they wanted. That was a form of direct democracy. Pure democracy. Nowadays, we have our democracy is voting our representatives for us. And for a long time, we were saying we can never implement direct democracy because it's inefficient. Because we can't go meet in a central assembly and vote for everything. That was so slow. The internet came around and people started saying, maybe we can achieve it now. No, but we couldn't trust the internet system because they're centralized. The governments might manipulate them. But now that we have blockchain, really and truly, we could implement direct democracy using blockchain because it's transparent and it can also provide certain guarantees. And there are even mechanisms of hiding who I voted for. Yet it provides you the proof that your vote was counted. So really and truly, we could implement direct democracy nowadays. And I think that is the interesting discussion that we should be having. What powers should we allow to be delegated away? And what powers should the people keep?
Amazing closing statement or closing question, nudging us. Maybe is that can be a guiding question for the breakout sessions we have. I open them up, and you are in groups of 3 or 4. Feel free to use the few minutes in the way you like it, but please make sure everybody gets a chance to speak, and then we see each other in a few minutes to just close the room. Joshua, you're super warmly invited to join one of the breakout rooms. Of course, we can also understand if you're busy and need to go on to your next appointment. Thank you very much, everyone.